You didn't miss a breaking news alert because this didn't happen like a scandal. It happened like a software update. Quiet, technical, and easy to ignore. While America argued about inflation, immigration, and who was winning the culture war, one of the largest personal wealth transfers ever linked to a modern presidency was taking place in plain sight, not through factories or oil fields or defense contracts, but through code tokens and regulatory silence. No raids, no subpoenas on television, no dramatic footage. Just a logo, a coin, a promise, and billions of dollars moving faster than most people could understand, let alone react to. The unsettling part isn't that money was made. Money is always being made somewhere. It's that the system making it possible was being reshaped at the exact same time, by the same hands, with almost no public scrutiny. This is not a story about crypto hype or internet speculation. It's a story about power recognizing an opening, about how financial systems reward proximity more than innovation, and about how the most important decisions rarely look dangerous when they're happening. By the time the charts spiked and collapsed, by the time retail investors realized they were late, the real outcome was already locked in. This is a story about how influence becomes infrastructure, how access becomes an asset, and how in the digital age the most consequential deals don't require secrecy, only distraction. For years, the position was simple, blunt, and repeated often enough to feel settled. Cryptocurrency was unstable, unregulated, and dangerous. It wasn't just rhetoric, it echoed a broader American instinct shaped by financial crises, busted bubbles, and a deep mistrust of systems that move faster than the law. Crypto looked like chaos dressed up as innovation. Then the environment changed. A new administration entered office with a different philosophy. Markets don't self-correct, they fracture, and someone has to draw lines. The Securities and Exchange Commission was empowered to do exactly that. What followed was a wave of enforcement that hit the crypto industry like a sudden change in gravity. Lawsuits stacked up. High-profile projects collapsed. Billions of dollars in market value evaporated almost overnight, wiping out savings reputations and entire business models. To regulators, this was overdue accountability. To crypto companies and their users, it felt like suffocation. The industry didn't just lose money, it lost certainty. And in moments like that, politics stops being abstract. Millions of Americans owned crypto by then. Millions more believed it represented something bigger than profit, autonomy, escape, a hedge against institutions they no longer trusted. That frustration didn't stay on message boards. It turned into a voting bloc. This is where the reversal takes shape, not as a moral awakening, but as a strategic one. You don't need to believe in a system to benefit from defending it. You only need to recognize who feels cornered and what they're willing to reward. Promises of deregulation became promises of freedom. Criticism softened into endorsement. And behind the public shift was a quieter realization: if regulation could destroy this market, then influence over regulation could define it. What looked like a change of heart was in reality a recalibration of power. The same forces once dismissed as reckless suddenly became useful, not because they were safer, but because they were vulnerable. And vulnerability in politics and finance alike is opportunity waiting to be claimed. The pivot did not begin with a speech or a policy memo. It began the way many consequential decisions do, in private conversations far from public record, where power is discussed not as ideology, but as leverage. Inside the family orbit, crypto was not evaluated as a belief system or a technological revolution. It was examined as a pattern. A market defined by volatility, weak regulation, and a user base driven as much by emotion as by logic. More importantly, it was a market starving for legitimacy, searching for figures who could transform speculation into something that felt permanent. That hunger was the tell. NFTs became the proof of concept, not because of their artistic value, but because of how effortlessly money moved. Thousands of transactions flowed in, paid for with digital assets that bypassed banks' delays and scrutiny. The signal was unmistakable. Attention could be converted into liquidity almost instantly. From that moment on, crypto stopped being an abstraction and started looking like infrastructure one that rewarded familiarity over expertise and proximity over innovation. The insight was brutally simple. You don't need to master the system if the system reorganizes itself around you. What made this moment dangerous wasn't greed, it was clarity. Crypto offered something traditional industries no longer could: speed. Speed to market, speed to wealth, speed to relevance. There were no factories to build, no labor forces to manage, no zoning boards to appease, just code branding and timing. And timing was perfect. An industry under regulatory pressure is desperate for protection. A political moment defined by grievance is hungry for allies. The alignment felt inevitable. What followed wasn't reckless expansion but calculated escalation. Each step tested, measured, and refined. Public enthusiasm created cover. Complexity discouraged scrutiny. And the family calculus sharpened around a single realization: if political power could influence the rules of crypto, then crypto could be designed to monetize political power. At that point, the line between defense and exploitation vanished. What appeared from the outside as curiosity or experimentation was underneath a disciplined strategy taking shape, one that understood something fundamental about modern systems. In the digital economy, control doesn't come from ownership alone. It comes from positioning yourself so that every transaction, every shift in policy, every surge of belief quietly flows through you. The memecoin arrived dressed as a joke, but it behaved like a weapon. It launched into a market already conditioned to chase velocity, where belief spreads faster than facts and screenshots of gains function as proof of truth. Within hours, the charts surged almost vertically, a familiar pattern that seasoned traders recognize instantly and newcomers mistake for destiny. Millions of buyers rushed in, driven by a volatile mix of fear, loyalty, and the intoxicating idea that this time they were early. Social feeds filled with celebrations, with numbers climbing by the minute, with the illusion that wealth was being created out of thin air. But beneath the spectacle, the structure told a different story. Ownership was highly concentrated. Supply was controlled. The outcome, long before the first retail investor clicked buy, was already asymmetrical. As the price peaked, the moment felt euphoric, almost unreal, like standing inside a financial mirage. Then gravity returned. Not as a sudden crash, but as a slow, grinding descent that trapped latecomers in place. Accounts bled red. Optimism turned to confusion, then to silence. Nearly half of those who bought in lost money, not because they misunderstood risk, but because risk had been designed into the system. The crucial point is this: the collapse was not the failure. The collapse was the mechanism. Revenue didn't depend on the price holding. It came from issuance, from fees, from the simple act of participation. Control mattered more than timing, and control never left. While the crowd watched numbers fluctuate, the real exchange had already taken place. Attention converted into liquidity, belief converted into leverage. What pushed this moment from spectacle into something darker was what followed. Political power returned, and with it came regulatory shifts that felt less like reform and more like erasure. Definitions softened. Oversight retreated. Entire categories of assets were quietly declared beyond reach, not through dramatic announcements, but through technical language few people read. There was no victory lap, no celebration, just an eerie calm, as if the market itself exhaled in relief. For those who lost money, the experience felt personal, even humiliating. For those who controlled the structure, it was proof of concept. The memecoin was never meant to last. It was meant to demonstrate something far more valuable: that belief could be mobilized at scale, that regulation could be bent without breaking, and that in a system driven by momentum, the people who define the rules don't need to win the game. They only need to build it. World Liberty Financial did not present itself as a gamble. It presented itself as the next logical step, a transition from spectacle to structure. Where the memecoin thrived on emotion and momentum, this venture spoke the language of permanence, governance, lending, stability, institutional scale. It looked like maturity. A crypto bank without walls, without tellers, without the physical cues that usually signal accountability. Just a white paper, a token, and a promise that participation meant ownership. The architecture was clean, almost elegant. Buy in and you didn't just speculate, you gained voting rights, influence over future decisions, a sense of being inside rather than outside. But beneath that language of decentralization sat a far more traditional arrangement. Control was concentrated. Revenue flows were explicit. A dominant share of the upside was reserved from the start, insulated from market swings and retail sentiment. This wasn't an experiment searching for a model. It was a model searching for capital. And capital arrived often from places that couldn't show up any other way. Many buyers were foreign. Some were barred from contributing directly to American political campaigns. Others carried regulatory baggage of their own unresolved investigations, open questions, reputational risk. Tokens solved that problem with remarkable efficiency. They required no declarations of loyalty, no public endorsements, no paper trails that looked like influence. Just a transaction on a blockchain, technically legal, politically invisible. The timing was impeccable. Sales accelerated sharply after the election as uncertainty gave way to anticipation. Confidence returned, not because the product had changed, but because the environment around it had. Enforcement slowed. Lawsuits paused. The friction that once threatened the industry seemed to dissolve, replaced by a sense that the rules were no longer adversarial but negotiable. None of this required explicit coordination. That's what made it so effective. In systems built on incentives, clarity replaces conspiracy. When proximity to power aligns with financial opportunity, behavior adjusts on its own. Deals followed a pattern that insiders recognized immediately: buy in here, and doors may open elsewhere. Sometimes those doors led to partnerships. Sometimes they led to silence where scrutiny once lived. Publicly, everything remained defensible. Privately, the message was understood. World Liberty Financial wasn't just offering yield, it was offering alignment. And alignment in moments of regulatory uncertainty is priceless. What made this chapter unsettling wasn't a single transaction or personality, but the cumulative weight of normalcy. Each step on its own could be explained away. Together they formed a system where access replaced transparency and participation blurred into patronage. By the time critics began to ask whether lines had been crossed, the lines themselves had already been redrawn quietly, precisely, and in full view of anyone who knew where to look. What followed no longer fit inside the frame of domestic politics. The system began to stretch outward, quietly, almost effortlessly, into the global financial bloodstream. Stablecoins were the perfect vehicle. They carried the language of safety, of predictability, of a digital dollar that promised none of the drama of speculation. But stability at scale is never neutral. When a stablecoin linked to politically adjacent interests rapidly accumulated billions of dollars in circulation, it stopped being a technical instrument and became a geopolitical one. Money from state-backed investment funds moved through digital rails with a speed and opacity traditional banking could never allow. International deals were announced without speeches, without flags, without the visible rituals of diplomacy, yet the consequences were just as real. Foreign capital flowed into systems that directly benefited decision-makers, shaping the regulatory climate those systems depended on. Laws were proposed in the name of innovation. Markets reacted instantly. Asset prices climbed not because fundamentals had changed, but because expectations had. The feedback loop tightened. Policy signaled tolerance. Tolerance signaled safety. Safety attracted scale. And scale, once achieved, began to exert its own gravitational pull on lawmakers, regulators, and institutions that suddenly found themselves reacting rather than directing. This is where the story turns unsettling, because nothing here required corruption in the traditional sense. No envelopes changed hands. No secret meetings were exposed. The influence was structural, embedded in incentives that rewarded cooperation and punished resistance. A regulator didn't need to be told to hesitate. The system made hesitation rational. A foreign investor didn't need access to power. Participation itself created proximity. What emerged was a form of silent diplomacy conducted through balance sheets instead of treaties, where economic alignment replaced political negotiation. By the time critics began to argue that this blurred, dangerous lines between national interest and private gain, the architecture was already in place, humming smoothly, defended not by secrecy, but by complexity. And complexity in modern finance is often the most effective shield of all. In the end, the most lasting damage wasn't financial. It was conceptual. For generations, Americans were taught, sometimes cynically, sometimes sincerely, that public office and private enrichment should exist at arm's length, that even when power was abused, the boundary itself still mattered. What this era quietly dismantled was not the law, but the assumption behind it. The presidency no longer needed to be separated from markets when markets could be built to orbit the presidency. Wealth didn't have to be hidden when it could be normalized. Influence didn't need to be purchased outright when it could be engineered through systems that rewarded alignment automatically. Nothing collapsed. Nothing exploded. The country didn't wake up to a constitutional crisis or a smoking gun. Instead, it adjusted. The public absorbed the spectacle, argued over the noise, and moved on. Meanwhile, a template solidified, one where power generates opportunity. Opportunity attracts capital, and capital reinforces power in a loop so clean it looks inevitable. This is the part of the story without villains or heroes, only incentives doing what incentives always do. The danger isn't that this happened once. The danger is that it worked. Because once a model proves effective, it doesn't stay personal. It gets copied. And when that happens, the question is no longer who benefited, but what kind of system Americans are now living inside, and whether they'll recognize it before it stops pretending to be temporary. This story isn't about crypto, and it isn't about one family. It's about how modern systems quietly reward proximity to power, and how easily those rewards can be mistaken for innovation. When attention replaces oversight and complexity replaces accountability, the lines that once protected the public begin to fade without a fight. The warning here is simple. Democracy doesn't usually collapse in a moment. It erodes when we stop paying attention to how money, influence, and authority intersect. If this story made you think differently, help keep these conversations visible. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more deep investigations into how power really works behind the scenes.